Drew. She's a research scientist here with IPUMS and also the director of US Microdata. She's a social demographer with interests in using population representative data to study health, disability, and mortality. I don't know why that went dark, but I'm still here. I'll just keep talking. So she works on using population representative data to study health, disability, and mortality across the life course. Third is Casey Breen. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford. He completed his PhD in demography at the University of California, Berkeley, and he works on developing and applying computational and demographic methods to examine questions in population health. Our fourth presenter is Risto Conte Keivabu, who is a postdoctoral scholar in the Laboratory of Digital and Computational Demography at the Max Planck Institute of Demographic Research in Rostock over in Germany. He works to understand the population consequences of climate change, focusing on the impacts of heat and air pollution on health. And he has a PhD from the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. So as I believe the other sessions have gone, we'll do 13 minutes per presenter, hold questions to the end, and we'll hopefully have 15 minutes or so for Q&A. So let me welcome our first presenter, Dave Hacker.
Okay, this is a paper that's co-authored with Jonas Helgertz at Lund University and the Minnesota Population Center. We're using our new linked multi-generational longitudinal panel data from 1850 to 1940 to estimate child mortality at the very local level and producing, I think, about 100,000 new life tables. We're creating a database that people can use if they're interested in early life conditions and access. Let me say briefly a little bit of context. Many of you, of course, are probably not historians, but we work a little bit in the dark. The vital registration system that you're probably all familiar with was left to the states in the United States. And although we had a census beginning in 1790, the states were very late to adopt any system of vital registration. And by 1900, there were in fact only 10 of the, I think, 45 states in 5 territories had a vital registration system. And that was brought together in the first kind of national death registration area. And it wasn't completed until 1933. So until 1933, we do not have a system of vital registration. I should say birth registration comes a little bit later, but also finished in 1933. So we have a really weak empirical foundation of understanding the demographic transition in the United States, and especially spatial differentials in mortality and fertility. And that's what we're hoping to get a better picture of in this period. I will say the data have been used, and you can find, if you're interested in life expectancy, say in 1900, 1910, these data have been used, but they're only for the 10 states. So they're not representative. They're probably under-registered. So we have only national data up to that point. So we're going to be using what we call indirect methods. For those you might remember your demography class the first year, direct methods, just to contrast real quickly, typically, if you're interested in a death rate, you'll take a death registration records, a number of those, divide it by the mid-year population from a census. So you're combining 2 data sources, vital registration and a census, to get a death rate. We're dealing without that numerator. So we have to estimate using only living children, living populations, the mortality of the population. There's a number of indirect methods that have been developed to do this. The United Nations, because in developing countries, there's not vital registration systems in many cases. There's a UN's established a book. There's a recent one from IUSSP. And these methods look at cohort growth rates, these kinds of things to try to estimate mortality. So we're going to try to use the MLP data to develop a new indirect measure of child mortality. So 5 quick goals here. We're going to estimate child mortality at the couple level using, and we're going to measure child mortality in each decade, by race, in over 5 different areas of geography, or is it 4 different county, state economic area, state, and nation. We're going to use those estimates of child mortality as well. We develop undercount estimates as well with the MLP data. We're going to use all those estimates to build new life tables. Like I said, about 100,000 new life tables from this period by county, state, and nation. And we're also going to use those new life tables to make new fertility estimates also at that geography level. And eventually, we hope to put this all in a public data set where people can use it. If you're interested in early life conditions, for example, you may want to know the mortality in the areas your population came from. A bit about the IPUMS MLP project, Multigenerational Longitudinal project. It is using data that are no longer protected for confidentiality. We have names, we have all the information of every person in every census from 1850 to 1940, with the exception of 1890, which was destroyed by a fire. And we've used that information to link people from census to census. And we use their name, given name, surname, age, birthplace, race, any information contextual, where they're living, et cetera. And I can't see my own slides here, but we're linking, what was that? I said 52 million people, I think, between 1850 and 1940. Our study here, we're looking at just married couples who remain married to each other over a 10-year period. And we're looking at their children who are alive in the first of the two linked censuses and seeing if we can find them in the next of a two linked census when they should be 10 years older. And if we don't, we're inferring mortality from it. We end up with about 750,000 couples in the first decade that we're looking at, 1850 to 1860, and about 4 million or so in the later decades. About 60% we think of potentially linkable married couples we're finding. And we have high confidence in that they are the right couples because we have two people to link. Very briefly, the basic method is simple to describe. We link a couple, married couple from one census to the next. Here's Mary and Joseph Napier. We find them 10 years later, 10 years older. And they have 3 children in the first of the censuses, Maxine, Claudine, and Will. We find Maxine and Will 10 years older. In the next census, Claudine is missing, and we assume Claudine is dead. We're also looking for Claudine in other households, but we can't find her. We're just assuming she died. I know it's a big assumption. This is, evidence of absence is evidence of death in this case. We also do some work to try to estimate census undercounts, which are pretty large historically. We have people showing up in the second of 2 census. Maybe here's Steve Fry, age 10 in 1910. And we found his family 10 years earlier, and he's not there. And there's a lot of undercounting of really young children in particular. And so we are inferring an undercount. So we're measuring undercounts at the couple level, child mortality at the couple level. We're aggregating that at different levels of geography. So we're assuming Steve can kind of add him back and he's assumed to have survived then. I will say we take a couple steps. I'm not going to go through this. We force links. The IPUMS MLP is designed to be very confident in every link. So it sometimes does not make link when it should. And so we go through and force some links. We see this couple has 3 children with only first initials. The MLP didn't link them. We forced a link in this case and said, no, these aren't 3 dead children and 3 undercounted children. This is, they all are the same children. All right. What do we get? We get pretty reasonable results. Very reasonable results. This is 1870 to 1880. Our results are in red here. We do not have good national data, so I'm comparing it to a standard, a life table I published, and it's kind of hinky as well here. So you don't take that as like a gold standard, but we're getting really reasonable agreement. What happens at age, we move this to children age, let's say 9, many of those have left the household, they're harder to link, and we get kind of increasing differences in our expectations. So we focus only on children 0, 1, 2, and 3 years old who will be 10, 11 to 13 in the subsequent census to make all our estimates. We then take those estimates, aggregate them at the county, state economic area, state, national level. We then make a full life table. Everybody remember your demographic methods. This is kind of the brass relational models, and produce full life tables from that limited data. And let me show you some results. This is like a revelation for us. We have no idea what regional, local differences in mortality look like prior to this study, and we're finding some really interesting areas with high mortality. The Mississippi River, Red River areas where malaria was high. We're getting results that kind of agreed with what we expected, but it's just kind of one of these for a historian. I agree for it was just kind of a pleasure to see some of this data for the first time. That's just one example. I think it's white population. Here is the Black population in the same period. You see it's much higher mortality overall, but some of the same areas experiencing high mortality rates. That was 1870 to 80, I think. This is 1900, 1910. I could show you, there's so many to show you. I'll just give you a couple examples. Much lower mortality and Black mortality as well. So again, every 10-year census period, every county, state, and nation. We then use those life tables we've created. I could have shown you life expectancy as well, to create own child estimates of fertility. I think I'm in a couple minutes. I will just say that this is another indirect method of taking children who are living with their mothers. Let's say we have children age 3 living with mothers age 27, reverse surviving them using our new life tables to determine number of children born 3 years before the census in this case, number of women who were still alive at age 24, 3 years before, producing age-specific fertility rates, and from that, total fertility rates. So for every county, we are now producing new estimates of age-specific fertility rates, age-specific marital fertility rates, the Zellner indices of fertility for each year, each county, every year, 15 years before each census. So the fertility estimates look something like this. This is 1880. I don't know if you knew this before, but New England was the leader on the vanguard of the fertility transition. And this is where we see low fertility, and we see high fertility in the South and West. By the way, there's not hardly anyone living in the West in this period past the Mississippi. So those are all based on small data sets. Here's what the population, I would have to explain the Colin-Trussell little M index. This is where you see in red here, these are where couples are really actively controlling their fertility. This is the Black population in 1880, Black population in, white population 1910. We got a bunch of maps, but the point is we're getting very locally specific child mortality, life expectancy, fertility estimates. This is all a new indirect method. And we can do it at the individual level, so we can model, let's say, mortality in different couples. So we're quite excited about that. This is a relationship between wealth and child mortality in 1870 and 1860. Higher wealth couples have lower child mortality. Here's our to-do list. And I just want to end by saying the point here is to produce an aggregate data set that we'll put on the web, that if you're interested in localized conditions of life expectancy, let's say 1930 to 1940, where your population may have come from, you can use that and use our estimates. So that's it.
Hello, everyone. This study is an interdisciplinary collaboration with Carrie Henning-Smith of the Division of Health Policy and Management here at the university, Dongjuan Xu at Purdue University, and Sarah Flood, my IPUMS colleague. And this is work that came out of a Life Course Center funded pilot project. So thank you to the LCC. The two objectives of this study that I'm about to discuss were to first investigate whether mortality risks were higher for older adults exposed to the 1980s farm crisis, and second, to evaluate whether the widowhood effect was larger for rural older adults who lived through the 1980s farm crisis compared to older adults residing in other places during the same time period. Life course perspectives on aging stress the importance of age-graded transitions and provide explicit consideration of how we move through the life course alongside others, including spouses, children, and other family members and friends. Widowhood is a common later life transition. More than 35% of adults 65 and older are widowed, and widowhood is more common among women. We can think of widowhood as a stress-induced weathering process that imposes lasting emotional, physiological, and social costs on the bereaved spouse. The widowhood effect refers to a robust empirical finding across different samples and countries that the death of one's spouse increases the risk of one's own death for a period of time after entering widowhood. On average, the risk is especially high in the first 3 months after the death of a spouse, but remains persistently higher even after the first 3 months. There are several mechanisms that may explain the relationship between spousal mortality and poorer health and increased mortality risk for the bereaved spouse, including the weakening or loss of social ties leading to social isolation, worsening health behaviors such as poorer diet quality, more smoking and or drinking, and less physical activity, acute psychological distress that manifests in worsening physical health, particularly in an increased risk of cardiovascular events, and financial strain due to a possible decline in income or wealth following the death of a spouse. Although the widowhood effect is widespread, there is also substantial variability in the widowhood effect. For example, men experience a larger widowhood effect than women on average, especially at younger ages. There are also differences in the magnitude of the widowhood effect by cause of death and by race. In this study, we examine whether there are differences in the widowhood effect for older adults by rurality. On average, rural residents have poorer health outcomes and are older than residents of non-rural areas. They also possess limited healthcare resources and fewer financial resources, in addition to experiencing a variety of infrastructure challenges, including older housing stock, connectivity challenges, and transportation barriers. All of these factors could serve to amplify the impact of stressful life events such as widowhood on health and mortality. Previous examinations of trends in age-adjusted all-cause mortality for rural and urban areas have found a distinct and growing rural mortality penalty when residents of rural areas are subject to a greater risk of mortality than residents of urban areas. Although the rural mortality penalty has become essentially a social fact, we can trace the emergence of the rural mortality penalty to the mid to late 1980s. The mid-1980s, when the rural mortality penalty first began to appear, coincides with the timing of what has come to be known as the 1980s farm crisis. The 1980s farm crisis refers to a major rural economic crisis that took place between 1981 and 1986. It was characterized by plummeting land prices, record farm foreclosures, and the collapse of dozens of agricultural banks. At the time, it was the largest economic shock to rural areas in the United States since the Great Depression. The farm crisis had ripple effects on the local economy of affected communities that extended beyond the farmers themselves, including the failure of Main Street businesses and farming communities, and in economic sectors involved with the manufacture and marketing of agricultural inputs. The agricultural finance sector was particularly hard hit. Dozens of banks failed during this time period, with more than 60% of agricultural bank losses concentrated in Midwestern states. Although there is an overall trend of outmigration from rural areas in the United States, the largest population exodus was concentrated around the time of that 1980s farm crisis. Although estimates of non-metro population change during this period are not available for specific age groups, we do know that farmers who were the most likely to be displaced by the farm crisis were younger and better educated on average. Communities affected by the farm crisis, largely concentrated in the rural Midwest, experienced a sharp rise in the aging population. This was likely due to the large numbers of younger people leaving or staying away from Midwestern rural states. Shown on the left-hand graph, the share of rural Midwestern residents aged 65 and older, represented by the thick blue line, rose by 3 to 4 percentage points towards the tail end of the farm crisis period. We do not observe a similar sharp increase for other rural or non-rural communities. The graph on the right-hand side want to make sure that I don't have these reversed, but this one shows an increase of about 2 to 4 percentage points in the share of widowed rural Midwestern adults age 65 and older, also coinciding with the farm crisis, and not apparent for older adults residing in other communities. Previous work has linked the farm crisis to a variety of health outcomes, including an increase in farmer suicides between 1982 and 1985, particularly among those aged 65 and older, increases in anxiety, depression, and psychosocial distress linked to experiences with financial strain, and even short and long-term consequences for infants who had in utero exposures to the farm crisis. Prior literature indicates that the 1980s farm crisis had a scarring effect on affected communities, largely located in the rural Midwest, imposing widespread economic hardship and financial strain, elevating rates of anxiety, depression, and psychological distress, and causing the loss, at least temporarily, of younger community members. Based on this, we expect older adults in farm crisis affected communities to have experienced a higher overall mortality risk relative to older adults living in other areas. Because the scarring effects and reduced social supports imposed by the 1980s farm crisis may have made rural older adults living in the Midwest particularly vulnerable. We also expect that the experience of widowhood as an additional life course transition associated with weathering imposed a larger increase in mortality risk for older adults in farm crisis affected areas than for older adults living in other areas. For this study, we used data from the 1986 through 1989 National Health Interview Surveys linked to the National Death Index, also known as the linked mortality file, with mortality follow-up through December 31st, 2015. We limited the analytic sample to members of different sex married couples who were community dwelling, aged 65 and older at the time of the NHIS interview, who were at risk of widowhood. So we excluded members of these couples who died before their spouse did, so that they weren't at risk of widowhood. Because the linked mortality file data report the calendar quarter and year of death, we measure time in person calendar quarters, where duration began at the time of the NHIS interview. The outcome was the calendar quarter of death, and our key independent variables were widowhood, yes or no, and a 3-category measure of rurality: Midwestern rural, other rural, and non-rural, where rural was measured as non-MSA area. We include age, sex, race and ethnicity, education, and self-reported health status, and survey year as controls in all of our models. We fit 2 Cox proportional hazard models, one estimating the independent effects of widowhood and rurality, and the other including 2 interaction terms, one between widowhood and rurality and another between widowhood and sex. We consider the second interaction term due to findings in the prior literature about differences in the widowhood effect by sex. In this presentation, I will only report findings from the full model, including interaction terms. Roughly 67% of our weighted sample were women and 33% were men. 72% resided in non-rural areas, 9% in Midwestern rural areas, and 19% in other rural areas. By the end of the mortality follow-up period, 95% of our population had experienced widowhood. We find that the widowhood effect is largest for those who do not live in rural areas, with a hazard ratio of 3.33. Those who were not yet widowed, living in farm crisis affected areas, had a hazard ratio of 2.89, and those in other rural areas had a hazard ratio of 1.9. So we summarize the main finding of the model here, which is that among older adults who had not yet experienced widowhood, so over all the way to the left, those living in Midwestern rural areas experienced the highest overall mortality risk. With the onset of widowhood, differences in mortality by geographic location largely disappeared. In other words, widowhood appeared to exert a leveling effect on geographic differences in mortality for older adults. In sum, we expected to see a higher mortality risk for older adults living in farm crisis affected communities, measured here as Midwestern rural areas, and we expected to see a larger widowhood effect for older adults in Midwestern rural areas. What we found was that, as expected, the overall mortality risk was highest for older adults in farm crisis affected communities, but that the widowhood effect was largest in non-rural areas. This study has several limitations, but the one we are most concerned about is the sensitivity of results to sample selection. The results presented here reflect the exclusion of people who died before their spouse, leading us to exclude nearly half the sample, and most of those that we excluded were men. When we retained these people, the estimate of the hazard ratio for the widowhood effect was less than 1, indicating that widowhood was actually protective against mortality. Our interpretation of this counterintuitive result is that when we include people who did not experience widowhood and died early, we are unable to estimate the true effect of widowhood. The current study contributes to the growing literature on the nature, causes, and consequences of rural inequities by adding an examination of whether the widowhood effect is higher among rural older adults exposed to the 1980s farm crisis. We may extend the study in the future by examining rural and urban differences in widowhood in a more contemporary data set, given that the magnitude of the rural mortality penalty and the share of rural residents aged 65 and older have only continued to grow. So, wrapped up early. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, great. I'll go ahead and get started. First, thanks very much to the conference organizers and the chair of the session for putting this all together. I'm really excited to be here presenting my work on homeownership and mortality. So today's talk is going to focus on homeownership and mortality in the United States. So homeownership has huge cultural and economic significance here in the US. So the home is the single largest source of family wealth in the United States. And it's also part of the American dream, part of the dominant narrative of success in the United States involves owning a home. So you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a poster from General Electric, which came out in 1941, around the time when I'm going to be looking at homeownership. And it's the soldier who's about to go off to World War II, who's drawing a home in the sand, promising his wife that when he comes back, they're going to buy this home together and live the American dream. So of course, there's also striking historical and contemporary disparities in who owns a home in the United States. So my talk today is going to focus on homeownership and health, which is a really big umbrella. And I'm going to be just looking at one very small slice of that relatively understudied topic. So my research question is, what is the unadjusted difference in life expectancy between homeowners and renters? Are there racial differences here? And also, is there a causal impact of owning a home on how long someone lives? So just as a little bit of historical background, so there are huge black-white disparities in homeownership in the United States. So here on the x-axis, we have year. On the y-axis, we have homeownership rates. And we're looking at homeownership rates among male household heads, mostly estimated from full count census data, which is why there aren't any error bars here. And so you can see white Americans in 1870 had a homeownership rate of about 55%. And this gradually declined to about 50% in 1940, the period I'm going to be looking at today. And Black homeownership in the United States was very low beginning in 1870, just in the antebellum period, and increased gradually until 1900, and then leveled out during the Great Migration. And so in the period I'm considering today in 1940, white homeownership rates were about twice that of Black homeownership rates. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical causal pathways that link together homeownership and mortality. So the first pathway is stronger social networks. So we know that homeowners tend to live in the same neighborhood longer. They tend to be more likely to build stronger social connections to other people living in that neighborhood. They're more likely to be more embedded in their community and have stronger ties with, for instance, their primary care physician. These stronger social networks have a clear causal effect on mortality. The second potential pathway is wealth accumulation. I'm going to grossly oversimplify the very complicated relationship between owning a home and accumulating wealth. But while there's lots of heterogeneity, for most Americans, owning a home is a key vessel for accumulating wealth in the United States. The third potential pathway is lower health risk from substandard housing. So renters during the period when I'm considering were exposed to lots of environmental hazards like lead-based paint and mold, and also had a less of a financial incentive because they were renting to make improvements in their dwelling unit because they just didn't have that incentive. So finally, there's psychological benefits. So while this evidence isn't necessarily causal, that's a little bit more debatable. There's been some evidence linking owning a home to greater feelings of self-efficacy, life satisfaction, and overall happiness. So of course, when we think of that DAG, we also think of all these shared confounders between homeownership and mortality, such as individual resources, family resources, or early life health. So if your family has more money, they're more likely to help you buy a home, and you're also more likely to live longer. So to kind of try and get at this question, I create a longitudinal panel of brothers. So unfortunately, this study is restricted only to men due to last name changes for women during marriage, precluding accurate linkage. So here I first identify from the household roster in the 1920 census brothers. I then link these brothers in the 1920 census to the 1940 census. In the 1940 census, I observe them between the ages of 25 to 35. For this link here, I use the Census Linking Project. I've also done this with the MLP links. One slight caveat is the MLP links don't have a skip link from 1920 to 1940. So I went 1920 to 1930, 1930 to 1940. And the results were very similar with both sets of links. So finally, using links from the Censoc project, which we carried out at UC Berkeley, we linked these brothers to the Social Security Death Master File. So just to give you some sense, so these brothers were born in 1905 to 1915. So those are the birth cohorts we're considering. We then next observed them in the 1920 census, where we identify them in the household roster. In 1940, we observed homeownership and control variables. We can't observe adult siblings in the 1940 census because there's no variable allowing us to link those together. So that's why we have to do linkage back to 1920. And finally, we observe them dying between 1975 and 2005. So just to step through this with the Lexis diagram, so this is a classic tour from demography. So on the x-axis here, we have year. On the y-axis, we have age. And the cohort that we're studying is highlighted here in blue. So we're first identifying these siblings in 1920. Then we're observing homeownership, which is going to be the treatment, and other covariates in the 1940 census. And then finally, in this window of 1975 to 2005, so approximately between the ages of 65 onwards, we're observing deaths. So the analytic methods that I'm going to use here are quite straightforward. So first, I'm going to present results from a sample that we constructed just by linking the 1940 census to the mortality records. So not siblings, we just get a much bigger sample here. And so in the first model, I'm just going to include a simple dummy for whether or not someone owns a home and fixed effects for birth year. In the second model, I'm going to add in controls for education, income, occupation, marital status, and more. And my analytic sample here is about 820,000 white Americans and 35,000 Black Americans. And so the results here on the y-axis, we have difference in life expectancy between homeowners and renters. So this dashed line at 0 shows the adjusted life expectancy for renters. The orange circle shows in our unadjusted no controls model, the difference in life expectancy for Black Americans who owned a home versus who rented. And that's about 6 months or half a year. We see a highly similar association, both for white Americans and for Black Americans. And when we add in these controls, it's only slightly attenuated. And so this similarity between white and Black Americans is actually striking in that the median home during this period for Black Americans was only 1/3 the value of the median home for white Americans. So next we turn to our sibling subsample and we think a little bit more about causal identification. So how I'm going to argue that we're getting at causal identification is through a sibling fixed effects identification strategy. The goal here is to control for hard to measure confounders such as family wealth. I'm going to show you those exact same models that I just showed you on the sibling sample. And then I'm going to add in a third model where I control for family fixed effects and also birth order effects. And so again, here we see that in our model with no controls, that homeowners live about 7 or 8 months longer than their renter counterparts. Once we add in controls for education, income, occupation, marital status, state, and urbanicity, we see this association becomes slightly attenuated down to about exactly 6 months. And then finally, when we add in sibling fixed effects and controls for birth order, we see an effect of about 4 months. And so this is really the key finding of this study here. So there's a few other things that I look at. So how does this effect vary by home value? So there's a lot going on in this picture, but on the x-axis, we have the quartile value of the home. On the y-axis, we have the additional years of life. And as you can see, as the home value quartile increases for this orange dashed line with arrow bars, there's a huge difference in the unadjusted difference between life expectancy for homeowners and renters for the fourth quartile, and a much smaller association for the first quartile. So this is just selection. So rich people are likely to own more expensive houses. They're also more likely to live longer. Once we add in our controls, and especially once we add in our controls and our sibling effects, we see there's not really very much of a steep slope here. So we still see a positive effect for first and second quartile homeowners over their renter peers. And that's slightly larger, which is probably what we would theoretically expect based on our causal pathways like wealth accumulation and neighborhood effects for the third and fourth quartile. So a few considerations in future directions. So first, there's of course always the possibility of residual confounding within sibling pairs. And I'm going to briefly show you a robustness check that we ran to try and account for that. Second, so I'm observing home ownership status cross-sectionally at one point early in the life course. And as we know, people leave home ownership. That doesn't happen very often, but it happens. And more importantly, people come into home ownership. So that's an important consideration when you're thinking about these results. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. And finally, of course, this is very historically dependent for this specific time period in these specific cohorts. So just briefly to show you some of the robustness checks we ran. So the idea here is we're very nervous about residual confounding within siblings. So we want these two brothers to be as similar to each other as possible. So first we restrict to brothers who are both living in the exact same county in 1940. We restrict both the brothers who have the same marital status, brothers with similar levels of education, and finally brothers who were born within 5 years of each other. And so as you can see here on the figure in the right-hand panel, this black dashed line is our estimates from our full model. And when we refit this model with different subsamples with these different restrictions, we see almost identical results. So in conclusion, we find a causal impact of homeownership in early adulthood for men on longevity. And this is about a 4-month advantage. We also see large black-white disparities in homeownership. And we argue that these are going to partially account for black-white disparities in mortality. And so even though the unadjusted association for Black and white Americans is very similar, it's this unequal access to the treatment to homeownership that's really driving inequality here in mortality. And so just thinking a little bit about policy implications here. So first, some of the policy implications are that policies that equitably expand homeownership may help mitigate mortality disparities. So this is a little bit of a naive recommendation because the United States has tried this lots. There's a fantastic book by Kyanga Yamamata Taylor, who's a historian, called Race for Profit, that talks about the history of these types of expansionary homeownership policies in the United States and some of their detrimental effects. A second and perhaps more practical policy implication is to address the larger systematic issues advantaging homeowners and systematically disadvantaging renters, such as expanding policies to help protect renters. So thanks so much, and I'm happy to take some questions during the Q&A.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here to present this joint work with Ugofilippo Basellini and Emilio Zagheni, my colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research. And yeah, the title of this paper is Racial Disparities in Deaths Related to Extreme Temperatures in the United States. So in this paper, we focus on 3 main research questions. And the first one is, how did extreme temperatures affect mortality in the United States? And how does race stratify the relationship between temperature and mortality? And thirdly, how many more deaths would there have been if temperatures were those observed in the recent years, from 2006 to 2022, in which there have been several occasions of like extreme temperatures compared to previous periods. So with this paper, we touch on a literature that's particularly growing in recent years, that is interested in understanding how extreme temperatures, both cold and heat, impact mortality. And this literature has been particularly growing after the extreme heat event that happened in 2003 in Europe, and studies have been growing both in the European context, but also in other countries, for example, in the US, but also in low and middle income countries. And in this paper, we also focus on disparities in vulnerability, as there is extensive research showing that certain socio-demographic groups are more vulnerable to the exposure of extreme temperature. The socio-demographic characteristic that has been explored the most is age, as we know that exposure in early life, and especially after age 65, is the most consequential. And this is mostly determined by the fact that especially individuals aged above 65 have a cardiorespiratory system that is less able to cope with exposure to environmental stressors such as extreme heat, that particularly stresses the cardiorespiratory condition, as thermoregulation puts the body to a high stress. There are also studies looking at gender as a variable, even though in this for this variable, findings change depending on the country context, and also are not consistent when we look at either cold or heat. And also recently, there are also more studies looking at socioeconomic status as a possible factor determining disparities in the vulnerability to extreme temperatures. And these studies are particularly relevant in the past few years, in this time of climate change. And researchers have also conceptualized temporal-related deaths as a measure of the mortality cost of carbon. So the idea is that the higher emissions, the carbon emissions that we are experiencing due to industrialization are determining global warming, that then determine deaths that there would not have been if these CO2 emissions would have not been happening. And looking at the, let's say, climate change attribution, so looking at how much, let's say, human-led climate change determine this increase in excess deaths, recently studies have also looked at how many deaths have been determined by this increase in temperatures in the recent years. And in this paper, we look at racial disparities in temperate-related deaths. And we do so touching on a literature related to environmental justice that has mostly focused on the exposure to air pollution, but that is also incorporating other types of environmental exposures, environmental risks. And looking at temperatures, there has been some historical evidence on racial differences in the seasonality of mortality, both in the 19th and 18th century. And there's been also some recent research looking at exposure to heat, and but this has been mostly focused on single cities or counties, and not at the whole United States. And the mechanisms that kind of like explain disparities in vulnerability to extreme temperatures by race are mostly related to three factors. One is related to exposures. And for example, there is a paper that shows that Black communities are more likely to live in parts of the cities that are, for example, the heat islands, where temperatures are higher compared to other places or the locations in the city. And there is another factor, that's susceptibility. So they might have worse health conditions in their later life. And the third factor is related to the access to social and medical support. And in this case, there are several findings showing that access to social support during a heat wave is particularly relevant, as isolation is a factor that enhances dramatically the risk of death during a heat wave. So taking these factors into consideration, the increase of heat phase due to climate change could exacerbate existing inequalities and determine even larger environmental injustices. So with this study, we try to contribute to the existing literature using data that covers the entirety of the contiguous United States from 1993 to 2005, and for individuals aged 65 and above. And we estimate both the effect of heat and cold on mortality by race compared to some of the previous studies that only looked at exposure to heat. And we also try to make an assessment of the excess death rate by race if the temperature in our period of study would have been those from 2006 and 2022 that they have experienced several severe heat events, like, for example, 2022 was one of the hottest year on Earth, that probably this year would be even hotter than 2022. And to do so, we use several data sources. The principal one that we're using is the death counts provided by the Berkeley Unified Numerated Mortality Database. And then we have population estimates by race provided by the Bridge Race Population Estimates. And as we don't have the full death counts for some missings in the data, we adjust these using the H&D dataset. And when it comes to the meteorological information, we use the GridMet data. That is high quality data, gridded dataset for meteorological variables that has a resolution of 4 kilometers, and we use the mean of the 4-kilometer grids in each county. And in this dataset, we have information on temperature, precipitation, wind speed, and solar radiation. And we also introduce other possible contextual covariates, such as PM 2.5, air pollution. And we also have some other contextual factors that are, for example, unemployment rate, the percentage of SNAP beneficiaries, and the median household income in the county. So in our analysis, the unit of analysis are basically about 3,000 counties that we observe from 1993 to 2005 monthly. And so our main variables are basically the death counts that we have by race, sex, and age for all the individuals aged 65 and above, and the same for the population estimates. And we capture exposure to temperature, capture the number of days in a specific month that fall within temperature bins that are created based on the county specific temperature distribution. And we use basically the first percentile, the first to the fifth percentile, and the fifth to the 10th percentile, and so on and so forth. For example, the very hot days would be those above the 99th percentiles. And these are, and we don't use, we also tested the same analysis using absolute temperature bins, and results are quite similar. But nowadays, using relative measure of temperature seems to be the most appropriate way to go. And in the empirical strategy, we use a Poisson regression with the fixed effects. So the fixed effect would be county month and month by year fixed effects. And in this way, we try to basically account for possible biases related to seasonality or other factors that might relate to higher increases in deaths in certain times of the year. And we also control for all the factors that I explained before. And we also, importantly, run also a model in which we add an interaction with race. So in this way, we try to get the closest possible to the causal effect of an extra day in a certain temperature bin on the monthly mortality rate. So these are the main results. And here you can see that both cold and heat increase the monthly mortality rate, but we observe also differences if we look at the different racial groups. And when we look at the pooled sample, we see that the increase with an extra day at the 99th temperature percentile increases the monthly mortality rate by about 2. But if we look at the blacks, this is about 6, and for the other racial groups, this is even higher. when considering a possible the excess rate, if temperature would have been those in 2006, between 2006 and 2022, we basically grouped years in 5 groups. And we can observe that especially in the years 2001, 2015, the excess death rate would have been even higher, especially because in this period, 2011 has been one of the hottest years in the US. And we can observe that the disparities would have been, the increase would have been even higher for Blacks compared to whites, and the difference accounts for an almost a double increase in the death rate. And if we plot basically this, in this case, I have the temperature as basically the counterfactual if temperature would have been those in 2022, and we can observe that the areas that would have, if in 1993, 2005, the temperature would have been as those in 2022, the excess death rate would have been even higher in the southern parts of the United States, and that increase would have been even higher for Blacks compared to whites or the other racial groups. So some of the limitation of this study is that we cannot really try to infer which specific factors determine race disparities. So we don't know if this is mostly related to disparities in exposure due to living in the heat islands or not, or if it's determined by existing health conditions, as we don't have information on that. And we have some missings in the death counts in this data set, but we try to a certain extent adjust this using the H&D dataset, and we only focus on this time period because from 1993 to 2005 we have the most complete death counts. Also, when looking at the excess death rate, these projections do not assume any adaptation or change in population structure between 2006 and 2022. So to conclude, we can observe that both extreme cold and heat increase mortality in the United States. But when we look at racial disparities, we don't see any disparities when we focus on exposure to cold temperatures, but we can see disparities in the effect of cold temperatures that are larger for racial minorities. Also, considering recent and future possible increases in temperature, this could exacerbate even more racial inequalities, and making climate mitigation policies, so reducing CO2 emissions, and adaptation policies, so providing certain facilities for individuals during heat waves or heat health plans, could be particularly critical in the future. So thanks a lot.